call this work session meeting of the San Marcos City Council to order. Today is Tuesday, May 16th of 2023. The time is 3:01. Ms. Trevino, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Prather. Here. Mr. Scott. Mr. Gleason.
Here.
Mayor Houston.
Here.
Ms. Garza. Mr. Gonzalez. Here. And Mr. Mendoza.
Here.
We have a quorum present.
All right, and now we will have our citizen comment time period. We welcome speakers at work sessions and regular meetings. Persons wishing to speak during the citizen comment time period must have signed up at the city clerk's office prior to noon. If you wanted to speak online, you need to email citizen comment yesterday before 5 o'clock in order to get a call-in number and a link. You may speak once during the citizen comment time period, and we do not yield time to others. If you speak now about a public hearing topic, we ask that you not repeat the same comments again during the public hearing on the same topic. You have 3 minutes to speak once you state your name. A timer is displayed on the screen, as you'll see up here. You'll start in the green and the countdown begins. You'll have 20 seconds left when you're in the yellow part of the timer. When the timer is red and you hear the bell, your time to speak is up. The mayor and council will endeavor to ensure that meetings are conducted in a courteous manner and in an atmosphere free of defamation, intimidation, personal insults, profanity, or threats of violence. Today, our first speaker will be Noah Brock, followed by Annie Donovan, Maxwell Baker, and Lisa Marie Capoletta.
Good afternoon, members of the City Council. My name is Noah Brock, and you've guessed it, I'm here to talk about the SMART terminal. Or should I say Axis? You know how I found out about the letter that was sent to city staff in response to our requested changes? A random person told me it was put into the FAC, not city staff who agreed to keep us informed. There has been no outreach from city staff to even include us. So let's get back to this development agreement. This was voted on and approved January 17th with very little public input. Mr. Mendoza, you asked the developer, will you be having public meetings with the neighbors and the neighborhoods? They answered they were not required to, but they would continue to have public dialogue or open dialogue. Mr. Prather, you asked, is this dialogue or do we need to put these environmental standards into the agreement? How do we make this top notch? If we pass this, there's no way to make changes. There are many things in this development agreement that the public finds problematic, but I want to point out the elephant in the room. Contract zoning. Contract zoning is when there is a contract between a municipality and a developer where certain zoning is agreed upon in exchange for something in return. What makes this practice illegal is when the municipality bargains away its power of authority in return. The contingency in the Smart Terminal Development Agreement states this agreement and any annexation contemplated herein are specifically contingent upon the city zoning. So let me put this in perspective for you. If council voted to annex the property, but then voted to deny zoning, what happens? This triggers the contingency which states that the annexation could never have happened. But here's the problem. Annexation has to happen prior to zoning, so in this situation, it would have already happened. Therefore, annexation could not be removed, but the development agreement negates that. This is an example of the city bargaining away its power to vote on annexation because it is directly connecting to a zoning vote that happens after the fact. Under common law reserved powers doctrine, the government may not contract away its police power, but must retain the right to modify regulatory requirements as needed to respond to important public health and safety concerns. It may not waive the right in return for private concessions. Please don't underestimate our tenacity, and don't underestimate our resources. It should be very clear by now that we are not going to stop fighting this. We have not missed a single council meeting since we found out about this proposed development, and we have not missed a single opportunity to keep you informed. So just ask yourselves, who would you rather be in a legal battle with? An outside developer or the people you represent? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Annie Donovan.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Annie Donovan, and I'm here to talk about the I think it's now called Axis Truck Terminal, or is it Inland Port, or is it Freight Transportation Hub? After reading over 20-plus business ad articles, it's obvious that the name Logistics Park is just a flashy way of saying freight storage yard. All of these are the same. Did you know the development agreement has a waiver to allow the maximum block perimeter increased from 5,000 feet in city code to 10,000 feet? This means that a building longer than a mile can be built. The Smart Access property is about 3 miles long. On January 17th, City Council gave the developer the okay to build a building about the width of 1/3 the width of the property. Additionally, the maximum height for buildings per city code in heavy industrial is 62 feet. Essentially, the developer can build 3 one-mile-long buildings that are 62 feet high. This will overshadow the entire area. This is one of the many issues the community has with the development agreement. But alas, it was voted on and approved back in January. Now when we ask to modify it, the developer flips us a bird and states, quote, "Scarborough is committed to the terms of our existing agreement." Since February, the community has been educating ourselves and trying to understand why this development is under consideration. We've read through the development agreement, we've read through city development codes, and we've read through ETJ and county development codes. What we have deduced is that we don't need the developer as much as the developer needs us. But the city gave away their power when council approved an agreement that allows contract zoning on January 17th. Of course the developer is happy with the current development agreement. It gives them the authority and the upper hand. Is there something the developer knows that we don't? They put out at least 20 more PR articles advertising the Smart Access Logistics Freight Storage Yard as if it's a done deal despite no official approval. We've started to wonder, is there something going on behind the scenes? Both city staff and council have dodged many of our questions or don't respond, so how can we have faith that you are doing everything by the books? After all, Mayor Houston, you have already inquired about moving the July 3rd zoning vote to an earlier date, ignoring the official vote of council and the needs and requests of your citizens and neighbors. How is it democratic to go behind everyone's back to change the date? Council, your legacy is on the line and will be determined based on your actions over the coming weeks. Do you want to be remembered as the council that sold out your constituents and neighbors and destroyed the integrity of San Marcos? Or do you want to be remembered as the council that stands up and preserves San Marcos? Now is the time to strap on big person boots and prove that San Marcos is an exceptional town that stands up to protect its integrity, its people and neighbors, and its legacy. Say no to heavy industrial and say no to Axis Logistics Park. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Maxfield Baker. Is he online?
No, ma'am.
And I don't see him here, so we will skip to our next person. Is Ms. Capoletta online?
Good evening. My name is Lisa Marie Capoletta. I live at 1322 Belvin. The proposed smart terminal will be 4 times the size of Disneyland in California, 10 times the size of Fiesta Texas in San Antonio, 80 times the size of the Outlet Mall in San Marcos, and 10 times the size of Six Flags in Arlington. Who has spoken on public record for this development besides the developer, who is also the landowner? Legal battle, she's right. Get ready to buckle up. Some of you are refusing to return phone calls and texts from the very people who voted for you and allowed for yard signs of yours to be put in their yard. Not to mention the federal elected officials that I am currently in communication with, as well as federal agencies that I'm calling. Saul, you kept your promise. Alyssa, you kept your promise. Shane, thank you for keeping your promise to protect the neighborhoods in our river. Access. Does that make us the allies? Jude, you always say that you listen to the citizens when large groups show up, and for months and months and months, these individuals have shown up. You voted against meet and confer, but you can't listen to and some of you have never even showed up to a public hearing. Now, one of you wrote on October 17th, 2021, "I so appreciate the outpouring of support that I've received for my campaign. I want to continue my service on the City Council as a voice between local government and everyday citizens of San Marcos who work hard to improve their lives." Yeah, right. Like the fire stations you want to strap the working class for. On council, I have supported relief for small businesses and I will continue to promote and support small business. And then you say later, fiscal responsibility, basic services, and you will support balancing our city's growth while protecting the environment, the rivers, the neighbors will be your highest priority. I say to that person who wrote that, who was the elected official, Psalm 55:21, his mouth was smooth as butter, but his heart was at war. Swords were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. There was a trauma wound out. If there was someone with a trauma wound outside your house, you wouldn't say, we need to move on. I need to make my cup of coffee and I have other things to do. And I'm tired of city staff and the elected officials saying, we need to move on. We have other things that we need to do. I have egg on my face because some of you who I campaign rigorously for are not answering those texts and phone calls and are refusing to listen to the city of Martindale, who has sent you a memo, not to mention the leaders of the Hispanic community who have sent in a letter to the Daily Record. And I'm not understanding why any of you would be for 9% of San Marcos' total area to become an armpit, an industrial armpit. And who is this developer to say he's not going to negotiate? Are you guys a bunch of hayseeds up there, or are you statespeople? Thank you again, Saul. Thank you again, Alyssa. And thank you again, Shane Scott. Thank you for your time, and God bless San Marcos. And I think I just earned my wings, or another angel.
Ms. Trevino, is that all the folks who signed up for citizen comment?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. Then we will move on to item 1.
Receive a staff presentation, hold discussion regarding fiscal year 2023 budget process update, FY23 capital improvement program, CIP, and multi-year debt financing plan.
Ms. Reyes.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Today's budget workshop is the next step in our process to adopt our fiscal year 2024 budget in September. We have established that this budget will focus on core services, concentrating on the city's primary goal of safeguarding the health, safety, and welfare of our residents. This includes a commitment to maintaining infrastructure, providing a high quality of life, adequate support services, sound development, and protecting our natural resources. All of these flow from the strategic goals discussed by council and directors at the visioning session in January and contained in the strategic plan you approved in March. Council has committed to dedicating resources to public safety, including staffing as well as meet and confer, which takes considerable amount of funding and investment. Our employees are our most important asset, and I'm committed to evaluating our compensation plan and philosophy to ensure they are taken care of. It is important that the compensation and classification study is completed in a thorough manner so it serves as the master plan outlining how we will invest in our human capital to make sure that we can deliver core services and enhance the quality of life for our citizens. Our financial situation is challenging as we attempt to meet the service demands of our growing population and doing so in a financially responsible manner. It is important that we remain fluid, flexible, and adaptable as we develop our budget. Our first presentation is to receive an overview of local economic indicators, an update on revenues and general fund health from John Locke, Director of Finance. After we discuss the budget, Sean Condor, Director of Engineering and Capital Projects, will provide a presentation on the proposed fiscal year 2024 capital improvement plan. The CIP is a multi-year financial planning tool that helps us determine what projects should take priority for funding. These projects account for future growth of San Marcos, transportation, public safety, and utility infrastructure. Keep in mind that adoption of the capital improvement plan and its first year of funding will occur in September when we adopt our budget. I'd like to thank the staff for their hard work so far in this process and thank council and staff for your willingness to have candid conversations on how we can continue to enhance the service we provide to our community. We have a lot of information to cover, so I'll now turn it over to Mr. Locke. Thank you.
Mr. Locke.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. A look at the agenda of what we'll be discussing today. We'll begin with covering the budget development timeline and where we are in that timeline. As Ms. Reyes pointed out, we'll also discuss some economic indicators. We'll discuss some general fund revenues and some FY 2024 budget considerations. After that, Mr. Condor will come up and discuss the capital improvement program. So this first slide just shows our current budget calendar and where we're at in the budget process. We began the budget process in January with the City Council strategic planning and visiting session. That was followed up with a budget policy workshop in February, where City Council formulated the policy that staff will follow in building the fiscal year 2024 budget. That was later adopted by City Council at a council meeting in March. We have received the preliminary tax roll, and those numbers are included in this presentation to City Council today. And that gets us at our first budget workshop meeting, and there are a total of 4 budget workshops scheduled for the fiscal year 2024 budget. On this next slide, City Council has seen this slide before, and it just provides an overview of the timeline. It starts very broad during the City Council visioning session, where the Council sets their strategic planning, and it gets more refined as we move through the process. Right now, we are at level 3, which when the city manager delivers the general or the budget capacity as it relates to the general fund. The next couple of slides get into some information that's important to keep in mind as we're building the fiscal year 2024 budget. This first slide is intended just to bring to light that the city is a growing city. As you can see, from 2010 through 2021, we've grown from 45,000 residents to 68,000 residents. From that point forward, it's forecasted based on our average growth, which we're seeing about 2% a year, or about 1,500 residents a year. So in 2023, we're estimating to be just over 71,000 residents. Next slide, please. Another important factor, and this is a slide we have seen before to keep in mind, is inflation and the impact that inflation has on the city's ability to provide services. As inflation increases, if our revenues don't increase in a commensurate amount, it begins to erode our buying power. It costs more to provide the same level of services that the city was providing in the prior year. During the budget policy, we discussed, as an example, in fiscal year 22, the total inflation was 8% for that year. In that year, the total general fund revenue actually decreased year over year by 1.7%, or about $1.6 million. So we lost ground in terms of buying power in that particular year. Another way to look at this is on the expenditure side. Our fiscal year 23 budget is $108 million, and about $67 million of that is for personnel. So if you subtract that out, that leaves $41 million of budget remaining to provide services in terms of either providing direct services or purchasing equipment to provide services to residents. It would actually cost, when you factor in that 8% inflation, $44 million to provide that same level of service, because inflation had that impact of increasing costs by $3 million. Next slide, please. This next slide shows that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. All those extreme spikes in inflation that we've seen over the past 2 years, the movement done by the Federal Reserve Committee to increase interest rates to try and lower inflation seems to be working. This slide has 2 different inflation metrics. The first is, the red is the municipal price index. This is actually a combination of the consumer price index, the producer price index, and the construction cost index. And it's a measure more closely to what it costs municipal governments to provide services, as opposed to the consumer price index, which is more what it costs the residents increased to buy groceries and related items. So, and if you follow the red, you can see, going back a year, the municipal cost index was at 12.5%, significantly above the consumer price index of 8.25%. As we have moved through the course of the year, those have actually intersected, and right now the consumer price index is trending higher than the municipal cost index. The consumer price index is at 5%, and the municipal cost index at 3%. That is largely attributable to the cost of housing. We're still seeing an increased cost in housing, and that's keeping the consumer price index higher for the time being. One thing important to note in this is when you look at the March 2023 number that shows that it's 3% higher year over year, if you go back to a year ago, that number was 12%. So that means that we're 3% higher than the 12% that it was last year. So even though it's trending down, it's still a big number that we're overcoming. Next slide, please. Next, just a look at our unemployment rate over the course of the year. The city of San Marcos is in green, the state of Texas is in gray, and the U.S. nationwide is in blue. And interestingly, the city of San Marcos tends to trend the U.S. nationwide average, which is slightly below the state of Texas average. If you look in April of 2022, San Marcos was at 3.2%, was actually the lower of all three. And as you move through to March of 2023, we're at 3.6, so it's ticked up slightly, and which is at the same level as nationwide and under what the statewide average is of 4.2%. The next couple of slides are going to take a look at our general fund revenues and provide a historical look as well as a projected look forward. This first one is sales tax is our largest general fund revenue, and this shows revenue from fiscal year 21, 22, where we're forecasting to end the current fiscal year in 23, and then what we're estimating currently to be the budget for fiscal year 2024. As you look at the projected number for fiscal year 2024, just a couple other numbers to keep in mind. Our 3-year average growth in sales tax has been about 8.8%. So that's on average. Over the past 3 years, we've seen our sales tax collections grow by over 8%. If you look at a 5-year average, it's 6.5%. So we're seeing some significant growth in our sales tax collections. As you move through, we're actually forecasting fiscal year 2023 to finish over 9% higher than our fiscal year 2022 number. Through March of 2023, sales tax is $2.2 million, or 12% higher already than last year. We're just estimating that's going to finish around 9%. We've collected so far this year $950,000 more in sales tax revenue than what we estimated to collect at this point in the fiscal year. With that information in mind, what is being estimated currently for our fiscal year 2024 is a 5% increase in sales tax revenue for a total of $42.9 million. The second largest revenue source in the general fund is our tax revenues. This first slide shows how our taxable value has grown over the past couple years. If you look at fiscal year 2021 and 2022, there was a very small growth, about $6.7 billion of value was the total amount in both of those years. You see a big jump in fiscal year 2023, which into the current year, it grew 21%, up to $8.1 billion. As you're looking at the slide, the blue color is the taxable value. That's the value that we're able to provide operations and services as well as the general fund debt service payments with. The gray is the value of the TERS. So that value goes into a TERS fund and can only be used for the specific purposes of that TERS, which is a tax increment reinvestment zone. So I mentioned at the beginning that we've received our preliminary values, and our preliminary values show that we've added $1.5 billion of additional taxable value, and the new taxable value is $9.6 billion. Of that amount, $8.3 billion represents the operations and debt component, and $1.3 billion is the TERS component. The next slide will take that information and breaks it down in terms of revenue. So this is the tax levy that we've been able to generate from that taxable value. One note on this, fiscal year 2021, the tax rate was 59.3 cents, and the remainder of those years it's 60.3 cents. So as you're looking at the amount of revenue generated, there was a penny change between 2021 and 2022. As you can see, there was a slight change from 21 to 22 in revenue collections. As you're looking at this chart, the blue is for operations. So that's how we provide public safety and quality of life, parks and recreation services to residents. The brown is debt service. So this is the debt that's been issued for the capital projects that Mr. Condor will talk about a little bit later. And the gray is those tax increment reinvestment zones. So, for instance, in fiscal year 23, we collected 29.7 of the $48 million is for operations, 12.4 million is for debt, and 5.9 million is for the tax increment reinvestment zone. That makes up the total $48 million. With the preliminary numbers, will grow to $56.9 million, with 61% of that amount, or 34.6 million, being for operations. And then you can see for debt would be 14.4, and for the TER 7.9. And that's all based on the current tax rate. As we entered this year, 1 penny of the tax rate on just the operations and debt was about $700,000. It was the value of a penny. With these preliminary numbers, the value of a penny is just over $800,000, just looking at operations and debt. So of that $1.5 billion, this slide shows how much of that is new taxable value that was added to the tax roll. On the left-hand side, it just has a historical look, and you can see the last 2 years, really the last 3 years, or 4, we've really been adding more to the new value to the tax roll. In 2023, we added $390 million. In 2024, the preliminary numbers are showing $646 million added to the tax roll. If you look over to the right, it has a breakdown of what type of value was added to the tax roll. So new construction, you have a total of $486 million. And one interesting note I thought on this chart, if you look at the residential properties, we added 1,190 residential properties with a total value of $446 million. That on average is $375,000 of taxable value that was added per residential unit. If you look below that on the commercial units that were added, we added 10 commercial units for $39 million, which is $3.9 million per commercial unit. And that shows the importance of diversifying the tax base. As we grow the businesses, it diversifies the tax base, and it puts less of a tax burden on the residential side.
Mr. Locke, the 1190 residential, is that single family? I'm looking for where the split
Yes,
between the
ma'am.
single family and the multifamily.
Yeah,
Where would I find that here?
That would actually be a combination of a multifamily and single family added
Okay.
to the tax roll. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
And you can see in total, it adds up to 1,900 different units added to the tax roll for a total value of $646 million. That's the new value that was added. This next slide provides an overview of all the general fund revenues, looking at that same time span. We've already touched on sales tax. Again, we budgeted for FY23 $38.8 million. Right now, we're estimating to finish at $40.8 million, about $2 million higher. And the fiscal year 2024, based on a 5% increase, would be 42.9, so around another $2 million higher. Property tax for fiscal year 23, we're going to collect just over what we budgeted. We don't budget the entire levy to allow for some non-payment, and we are going to collect everything that we budgeted. And that, based on the preliminary numbers that were in the previous couple slides, would generate the $34.8 million property tax revenue in fiscal year 2024. And you can also see the rest of the general fund revenues. One other item I did want to point out is interest, which is the fourth row from the bottom. The total budget is $190,000 in the general fund, and we're estimating to collect $1.4 million. And that's directly impacted by the Federal Reserve increase in interest rates. That increases the returns on the type of investments that the city is able to invest in. So that's had a big impact on our fiscal year 2023 revenues, and will impact us in 2024 as well. The next slide has just an overview of some considerations for fiscal year 2023. In the general fund, as we covered, we're estimating that sales tax is going to be $2 million higher than what was budgeted, and interest income will be $1.2 million higher than what was budgeted. There's also, later on this evening, City Council will consider a mid-year budget amendment, and this is just a list of some of those items. As we began the fiscal year 2023 year, there were just over 50 different FTE requests, or full-time equivalent position requests, that we're not able to make it into the fiscal year 2023 budget just due to capacity issues. There wasn't enough revenue to add it into it at that time. Now that we have evaluated our revenues and they're ahead of where we thought we would be, then the mid-year budget amendment is requesting to add some of those FTEs into the current FTE count for the city. Just a summary of those is, City Council knows that we've been working on a public safety multi-year staffing plan. Requested in that mid-year budget amendment is for the police to have an additional 6.5 FTEs. That is 4 civilians and 2 police officers. And for the fire department to have 4 FTEs. There's also, you'll see the diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator position. This was actually a position that was already approved by City Council. The FTE wasn't included in the budget, so this is really administrative correction. We're just getting that in the budget. There's a position for community enhancement, the City Hall office remodel and relocation. This is a project that is attempting to bridge the gap until when we are able to build a new City Hall. Some departments are moving around throughout the city, and this budget amendment will cover the expenses to move those departments around. And then there's also an amendment on citywide mowing and the janitorial contract and the conference center parking lot. Conference center parking lot is with hotel tax dollars, and all of these items we'll discuss in more detail during the budget amendment later on this evening. Looking forward into the fiscal year 2024 revenue considerations, as we've discussed, there's an increase in the preliminary taxable valuations, and current preliminary showing $1.5 billion of additional taxable value added to the tax roll. There are some possible legislative changes that may impact the property tax revenue. Right now, the House and the Senate are at odds at what that'll look like. If it goes the Senate's way and they increase the homestead exemption, that has less of an impact on the city. If it goes the House way and and the cap is reduced from 10 to 5%, that'll have a direct impact on the city's tax revenue that we're able to collect. We are seeing continued growth in our sales tax. We're estimating a 5% growth currently for our fiscal year 2024 budget. We'll also have a full year of the development services cost recovery fee adjustments. Those were approved earlier on in this fiscal year. They didn't become effective until March 1st of this year, so it's too new to really see what the true impact will look like right now. And we're in the process of doing our utility rate modeling. Preliminarily, there are a couple of the enterprise funds that are showing that we're going to need a rate adjustment of some kind. On the stormwater side, with the general fund taking over the capital improvement projects, that model is actually showing there's not a need for an increase, since the general fund will be issuing the debt and covering the debt for those projects. But on the electric and water wastewater side, those are showing that some rate adjustment will be needed, and that process is going through the Citizen Utility Advisory Board right now. On the next slide, it just has some expense considerations. We're expecting to get the compensation study results late in fiscal year 2023. As provided through the budget policy, there will be a 5% increase in total personnel costs included in the fiscal year 2023 budget for the implementation, or at least for the first phase of this adjustment. May more be needed depending upon the results of this. We're expecting to get the results in the late July, early August timeframe, so it'll be late in the budget process. We'll also have potentially 2 meet and confer agreements to implement. As we covered earlier, inflation does seem to be on a downward trend. It still is up, so it's something that we need to keep in mind as we're building our fiscal year 2024 budget. We're receiving multiple requests again for core services. Funding for one-time costs for capital outlay will be a consideration, and this is just as we look to decide how much money we'll set aside for City Hall, how much will cash fund capital outlay and capital projects. And the last item is just a different approach to fleet replacement. This will be an item that will come before City Council for consideration in the next, either in June or July. And it's trying to get in front of the fleet replacement. Under our current method, when we start in October, it's delaying the lead time on receiving those vehicles. The manufacturers open those windows in the late June to September time period. And if we can get in front of it and be able to purchase those or order the vehicles in that time frame, then it'll greatly reduce that lead time for us. So that's something that we'll bring to City Council for consideration in the next couple months. And that completes the budget portion. Prior to the capital improvement project portion, I'd be happy to answer any questions the City Council may have.
I have a question, Mayor. You caught my ear with the.
Mr. Scott, you going to ask your question?
Oh, thanks. You caught my ear with the 5% core. People hit you with core charges or knees or whatever. How much of that is actually business as opposed to residential for your core services? You said a 5% increase in core services.
Oh, the 5% was in the increase in sales tax.
Okay, you just said something about increase in the demand on core services.
Yeah, that is the request for positions for core services. I think that might be what you're talking about. I mentioned that.
Companies, yeah. Is it companies or residents? That's kind of what I'm trying to look at.
Oh, this is just positions. So this would be police positions, fire positions, park and recreation. These are.
So you're talking about just our staffing.
Yeah, just our
Yes, sir.
staffing.
Okay, yeah.
But,
Okay, thanks.
but as a rule of thumb, residential tends to be more of a frequent user of our core services versus businesses. So to answer that part of it in terms of growth, depending on what the proportion of growth is for residential versus commercial or industrial, the residential is going to usually use more of the core services.
Cool. Thank you.
Other questions? I have one about 4 slides back. You said funding something out of the general fund. Were you talking about stormwater?
For the
should've written down the slide number, my bad.
for the utility rate increase.
Yes.
Yes, and looking at the stormwater model, we won't need to do a rate adjustment in the stormwater fund, and that is due from the general fund issuing the debt to cover the projects, the capital improvement program projects for stormwater.
Okay.
So by the general fund doing that, it has eliminated the need for a rate increase in the stormwater fund.
That's what I thought you said. So are we going to just pay that out of general fund, or are we going to shift dollars from general fund to stormwater?
We will just pay it out of the general funds debt service fund.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
go ahead.
You talked about the mid-year budget amendments.
Yes, ma'am.
What does that mean in terms of the timeline for hiring specifically the diversity, equity, and inclusion coordination position? And isn't the funding source ARPA money?
Yes, ma'am, you're correct.
It is, and so I can speak to this one. It's actually, we're scheduling interviews now, and so it looks like, I believe they're scheduled for June 2nd is what we're looking at. This is just because whenever we have a position that council approves, we have to put a head count in the personnel roster. And so that's the piece that was missing. It wasn't the money. The money we're moving forward with, it's the head count in the personnel roster that this will fix, so that we have that head count.
I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, we will roll on to our next presentation. Welcome, Mr. Condor.
Thank you. Sean Condor, Director of Engineering and Capital Improvements, here to give the FY 2024 Capital Improvements Program overview. Next slide. So just a reminder, the Capital Improvements Program is a multi-year financial planning tool used to identify and plan major capital projects. It addresses growth, transportation, public safety, and utility infrastructure issues in conjunction with priorities as determined by City Council. The adoption of CIP and the first year of funding coincides with the adoption of the budget and uses a 10-year projection. Next. And so just want to clarify, before requesting funding, all projects in year one are evaluated for project readiness, staff workload, and the city's ability to fund projects. Next. Next, there you go. So just a reminder, the FY 2024 CIP projects will actually be funded in the FY 2025 budget, but we do look at it to project out any impacts to our budget. The annual general fund is typically limited to about a 3-year average of 10 million. In the stormwater, we're looking at about a 3-year average of about 6 million. And just a reminder again, the first year is the only year that we're approving funding, and those projects are well defined. As you get further out in the CIP, they're less defined, and they're really just placeholders in the CIP. Next slide. So some of the challenges we have with CIP, funding CIP projects is the utility debt models, as Mr. Locke indicated. On the utility side, our debt models does not drop off, our debt does not drop off until 2028, 2029. And what that means is a rate increase is the only way to fund new debt and new operating expenses. On the construction side, we're used to seeing a 5% increase each year. With recent inflation, it's been about 7 to 10% each year. But when you look at the data, we went back to 2019, and we're seeing bids are about 50% higher than they were back in 2019. As far as project scopes goes, they're just becoming more complex and larger. Neighborhood projects are just becoming more cost prohibitive. Next slide. So some of the goals, things we're going to do moving forward is we want to kind of change the message to the public. It's not start construction in your XYZ. It's start construction when funding is available. And we need to make sure the public is aware that some projects are going to expect changes in timing. We're going to avoid as much as we can, but we got to make adjustments according to funding. We're going to aggressively pursue grant and alternative funding on projects. Just so you see this evening, there's 3 projects on for a recommendation of support from council. That's an example of us pursuing those grant funding alternatives. What that means is timing of projects may be dependent on the grant funding. Some projects may move up or down depending on how they get approved or not approved or how we want to pursue those. We will only pursue projects $1 million and above just because of the extra strings attached to it. Typically, there's a higher design cost and a longer duration to project schedules, so we're going to limit it to projects $1 million and above. And we will continue to use impact fee and TERS funding as alternative funding sources. We do need to plan for a future bond election. There's a bow wave coming, and a tax increase is really necessary to fund some of these projects. And the CIP timing will continue to be adjusted to reflect the potential bond election. Next slide. So just a reminder of a typical life of a project. The number one complaint is projects take too long. And so just you talk about a simple project, it's going to take me 3 or 4 years minimum as a group to get that knocked out, and that's about a project from $200 to $1 million. A complex project, that's a project anywhere from $1 to $10 million. It's typically a 5 to 7 year process to get through all those, to get a project through. And a complex project, very complex, we're talking 10 million plus, that's an 8 to 10 year process. And so when you look at the CIP, a simple project will typically fund design in 1 year and construction in the other. On the very complex projects, we'll typically break that funding into 3. So we'll start the design in first year. That second year will be for finishing the design, maybe some right-of-way and utility adjustments for the electric. And that third year will be construction. Just some important notes. The last year is always for construction. We program best case scenario, and as challenges arise during the design process, that's when we start delaying construction funding. So we hope for the best, we plan for the worst, but then we make adjustments as needed. Next slide. Just a reminder on where the funding comes from in the capital improvements program. The general fund comes from property and sales tax, as well as license and permits. The stormwater fund is funded through the stormwater utility fee. The electric fund is through the electric rates. The water wastewater fund is through the water wastewater rates and impact fees. And then we do get external funding in the source of grants and other outside sources. Next slide. So this is kind of an overview of the CIP process. It's really a year-round process. All year long we get submittals from other departments and other folks that we consider. And then in December, or the October-December timeframe, that's when we hold our department reviews. We meet with each individual department. We get an update on the projects that are in the CIP, make sure the scope's correct, the budget's correct, and determine if we need to push this project out or not. Once we know that, then we meet and do a workload capacity in January, and that's where we make sure that if we do move forward, there's staff on hand that can get this project or take this project and move it forward. And then we look at the fund constraints in February. We kind of predict, we pull out the models and see what it's going to do to our rates, or make an educated guess, if you will, and see if there's something we can move forward with. We take it to P&Z in March, get a recommendation from them in April, and then in May we come to council with a recommendation.
Thank you.
Next slide. So for those of you not used to the CIP, this is just the 10-year spreadsheet is probably the most common thing people will pull out and look at. And so if you look at the far left, we have it grouped by category where multi indicates projects that have more than one funding source, but then you'll see general, water, wastewater, electric as well. The project ID, project name, description are pretty self-explanatory. And then you get into, we like to show the supporting strategic initiatives, comp plan goals, and prioritization rankings. I do want to note that this year we attempted to revise the ranking system from a scale of 0 to 70 to 1 to 10, with 10 being a project that really must move forward. The goal is making it easier for folks to understand a project that has a higher priority than others. And then you go into the funding categories as well as the years they're funded. Next slide. So this just kind of gives you an idea what all the color coding means. It's a little busy, but it's a big spreadsheet. And so what we try to do is indicate projects in brown as TERS funding. So either it has been approved for TERS funding or it would be eligible for TERS funding. The white and gray it means nothing other than it's just to break up the long spreadsheet. Blue projects indicate potential future bond projects. And so you'll see them blue. Keep in mind, it's the last year is what we're targeting for the bond program. If there's funding in, say, 24, 25, we're going to use regular CIP funding for that, but it's the last year that we're targeting for bond election. And the reason we need that money up front is we want to make sure we get a good cost estimate. So if we do proceed with the bond election, we have good numbers to work with. And then the pink represents impact fee eligible projects. Next slide. So we do have an interactive PDF. It's on our webpage. But I do want to point out there is a bookmark feature on it. So if you're not used to that, when you pull up Adobe, you can click on bookmarks. And we have bookmarks that show, the first one will be a P&Z recommendation letter. And then it has the table of content, what to expect. And then we have the 3-year list. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the first 3 years are a little bit more detailed than the last 7 years. So we reduced that down for folks to just if they want to focus in on that. And then we have it broken up by each year. And for details for the next 3 years, we'll have a map of all the projects in that funding that year. Then we'll have a project list of everything that's getting approved that year. And then we have project details for each individual project within that 3-year period. And then you have the 10-year list, which is the big one, that has all the projects. And then it's the same thing. It's basically the details for each individual. You'll have a map of each individual year and the project list, but we do not have project details for anything from the last 7 years. And then at the very end, we'll have the comprehensive plan goals. Next slide. So CIP totals by fund. Right now, we're sitting at about $72 million. General, we're at about 16.7. We want to be about 10, so we're a little bit over to there. Water, wastewater, we got 15.8 for water, 23.8 for wastewater. Storm is about 7.8. Electric is 7.9 for a total of $72 million. And I'm going to go in a little more detail later on about each of those funds. Next slide. So this just shows a projection of the CIP out to year 2033, and you can see that bow wave I was talking about. That's that big spike in 2026. That's where we're targeting a potential bond election. We will just keep pushing out those projects until we decide to move forward with that. But it kind of shows you, we'd like to see about an average of about 50 million. And so we're a little bit higher, but some years we're a little bit lower, but that's our typical goal. Next slide. So I'm going to go into each fund and give a high level on all those. So this is the general fund, and when I say significant project, I mean a project over $1 million. It's just a significant dollar amount. In FY 2024, the Fire Station 3 remodel is sitting at about $3 million. On the Airport DOL, Department of Labor land acquisition, we estimate $3 million. I do want to note that we are working with the federal government to see if maybe we can get a portion of that donated, so we're hoping not to need all that. If we're lucky, we can get it for free, but that's a stretch to think it'll happen, but this is a worst-case scenario, if you will. Fire station replacement truck is at 1.6. I will note that we got an email this week on that is probably going to be closer to 2.3. They've reached out to the vendor, and the prices have just continued to go up. So I will expect that to change in the months to come before September. The Bishop Street improvements, we're sitting at about 1.5 million on the general side. City facility major maintenance improvements are 1.25 million. And the Yule and Quiet Zones, it's at $1 million. That one, I believe, was identified for ARP funding. So once that gets approved, we can remove that from the CIP. So looking at the general fund debt models, like I said, we'd like to hit an average of about $10 million. And so we have clearly exceeded that. So we do anticipate a bond election to support projects beyond FY 2026. Next slide. On the water, wastewater side of things, again, significant project, anything over $1 million. The Highway 80 Utilities project, that's at $25 million. And that project is being driven by the development on the north side of town. What's happening there is the Blanco Vista Trace area, it all falls into a lift station on River Road. Well, that is it's getting near capacity. And so
I'm sorry, you said Blanco Vista Trace?
Whisper.
I thought that's maybe what you
Yes.
meant.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
of Whisper and Trace when it comes to pavement issues we have, so. So those all outfall to a lift station on River Road, and that is becoming near capacity. And so we got to get this lift station in so we can continue that up to pick those off and relieve that lift station. We do have a project in the FY 2023 CIP to do a temporary stopgap measure. That's the Davis Lane lift station to try and help alleviate some of that pressures on that lift station.
Sorry, I have a question with that, Mayor, before I get too far along. You said putting in a lift station, but that agreement that we had, development agreement with Whisper, didn't we include that in as
This is
something for
further
them to
down.
pay?
It's much further downstream.
So they don't have any,
So there is a lift station, I'm not 100% sure, but there probably is a lift station in Whisper, but there's a gravity main from that part of town. It comes down just along River Road and on the San Marcos River, right about where Davis Lane, the Coys is, that's Davis Lane. There's a lift station there that pumps it up to the wastewater treatment plant. So that's the lift station that's having problems.
okay. Thank
So.
you.
Bishop Street improvements are about 1.5 million. Oh, I'm sorry. I went back a slide. So jumping back onto it, again, Bishop Street improvements, that's another big project. We're having some issues. That's a $3 million that we need to get finished up. Wastewater treatment plant, I said it before, we bought all that water with ARWA, we got to treat it now. And so this will start the design process. It will not finish it, but it will start the process to get that design going while we make the determination if we're going to do a second plant or upgrade the existing. And then Sunset Acres subdivision, the $1.5 million, we had that discussion a few months back about getting that wastewater expedited. So this is the funding to get that done, and our hopes to get that advertised here by the end of the year and get going on it. When you look at the debt models, again, like stormwater, we gain no debt capacity until 2028. There was no rate increase requested in FY 2023 despite data recommending it. So we do anticipate a rate increase in 24 to cover basic operating and existing debt services. I do want to point out staff is working on potential water sales to help provide additional debt capacity. Agreement was approved in March, and we are anticipating it to go into effect in July, so we get our first payment. So that should help offset some of the payment issues we have there, or the debt issues we have. Next slide. On the stormwater fund, the big project is this Bishop Street improvement, $6.5 million. So remember I said these neighborhood projects are getting cost prohibitive. We'd like to see about $6 million is our threshold, and we're exceeding it with just one project here. So And like I said, you're going to see some of these projects are just going to start getting divided into smaller phases in the future. When you look at the debt models, we gain no debt capacity until FY 2028. And so what that means is we cannot support more than a $6 million average moving forward without a 6.5% rate increase each year. Next. So I want to point out, this, as Mr. Locke indicated, for FY 2023 through FY 2025, the goal is to use general funds to issue funds for stormwater projects. So instead of issuing debt using stormwater funds, we're going to issue debt with general funds. And what that means, that will help reduce the proposed rate increases moving forward. And as Mr. Locke indicated, preliminary data suggests no rate increase is anticipated on the stormwater side for FY 2024. Next slide. So on the electric side, projects over $1 million are the Sunset Acres underground conversion, which is sitting at about $3.5 million, the Hilltop T1 transformer replacement at $2 million, and the Redwood Reconductor at $1.5. Similar to the stormwater and water wastewater, we gain no debt capacity until 2029. Rate increases for FY 2024 are anticipated to cover basic operating expenses and existing debt services. Similar picture, we increased the rates in FY 2022 for the first time in 8 years. We did not do it in 2023, despite data recommended it, so we will anticipate it this year, and growth has been the primarily residential and not large commercial where revenues are greater. Next slide. The CIP went through the P&Z process, and it was recommended for approval with no amendments. Next slide. So we're going to go through the City Council budget workshops in May through August. There could be I anticipate some revisions coming based off what we discussed earlier, and we're still fine-tuning some of those models. So we'll come back to you with any changes that need to occur. And in September, we'll adopt the budget adoption by City Council will include the FY 2024 CI projects and to be determined future bond election. Next slide. And for those who want to know where the CIP is located, there's our website. If you don't want to remember that, just go to City of San Marcos webpage, click on departments, click on engineering, 10-year capital improvements program. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, I have two.
Okay.
Back on slide 31, you said something about projects being impact fee eligible.
Yes.
I
Those are pink. Projects in pink are
Right,
impact fee eligible.
I understand that, but what does that mean?
Sure. It means that when a developer develops, they pay impact fees
Right.
for the system. And so there's a pot of money that's sitting aside. And so when we do new upgrades that are used to serve those developments,
Okay.
we will pay out of those impact fee
Okay.
funds.
Okay, and there's limitations on what we can use impact fees to pay, okay.
Yeah, it's only for new
Got it.
infrastructure.
And I may have missed something when you talked about, also on 30, I think it was 31, the Euland Road Quiet Zone. Weren't we applying for a grant? Were you saying that grant did not come through?
We have not heard back. We were
Oh,
supposed to
okay.
hear back in March, but I guess with all the stuff going on, they've not gotten to
still
review
hope.
those. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Others? Others? Beat you to it. It appears that y'all did such an excellent job. We just don't have a lot of questions because everything that I would have asked was in the slides. That's great. Ms. Reyes, anything else to close this out?
No, there's still a lot of discussion to talk about during the budget process and more information for us to get so that it can be clearer in terms of what money we actually have to work with in the budget. This is just our way of making sure that we get to you sooner in the process and start priming you for some of the things that we're seeing and the information we're working with. So nothing further at this time, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Trevino, we will go on to, I guess it'd be item 2.
Executive session in accordance with the following: A, Section 551.071, consultation with city's attorney, and 551.072, real property, each regarding the airport lease with Blue Skies Aviation. B, Section 551.071, consultation with city's attorney regarding the provision of EMS services in the city. C, Section 551.071, consultation with city attorney regarding the Smart Terminal Development Agreement.
Okay, I'm looking for a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion for Mr. Gleason and a second for Mr. Scott. Ms. Trevino, let's vote.
Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Gleason.
Aye.
Mayor Houston.
Aye.
Ms. Garza. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Mendoza. Mr. Prather. Okay, passes 7-0.
Okay, and we're going into executive session at 4 o'clock. have returned from our executive session, which we ended at 5:30. Question and answer session with press and public. Ms. Trevino, has anyone signed up?
No, ma'am.
Okay,
No
then
sign-ups.
I will accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mayor, did you want to ask for the public if there was anybody wanting to ask for Q&A? Or was it just for those signups only?
I was looking to see if we had
Okay.
people signed up.
No signups, but I don't know if there's some in public.
I will ask
Sorry.
then.
Okay.
Question and answer with the press and public on items that are on the work session agenda. If we do, you need to come to the podium, state your name, and you can ask questions, ask them all at once, and if we can answer them, we will do that.
Good evening, City Council members. My name is James Cooper. I'm here as a representative from the Hays County EMS Association. We just wanted to come out and kind of address some concerns that you guys may have had from the agenda from earlier today, and make ourselves available to you if you had any questions for us. I'll start with stating that it has never been, nor do we intend to ever go on strike. We feel that it's irresponsible to the citizens of our areas and the general public at large. And we're hoping that we can move forward with our NLRB election and start working with y'all on a much closer level. Is there any questions that you guys had for us?
Now, I don't believe now would be the time. Would that be correct, Mr. Guerra?
That's correct, Mayor. And really, again, just a reminder, this is questions from the public, not commentary as citizen comment, but appreciate your time.
Yeah, appreciate your offer.
Sorry.
It just, it's not the right time for that. Okay. Anyone else? If not, I will accept a motion to adjourn. And I had one from Mr. Scott, and I believe, Mr. Prather, you had seconded that. Mr. Trevino, let's vote and see who wants to adjourn this meeting.
Yes, Mr. Gleason.
Aye.
Mayor Houston.
Aye.
Ms. Garza.
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Mendoza. Mr. Prather. And Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Motion passes 7-0.
And we are adjourning the work session meeting at 5:33. Council